Gabriel, can we go ahead? Excellent. All right, good afternoon. Our Secretary General is back in Dhaka in Bangladesh after having spent the day in Cox's Bazaar. And you know, this is part of his Ramadan solidarity visit with Rohingya refugees and their Bangladeshi host communities. The Secretary General has had the chance to meet with refugees. Many of them were young men and women who told him about their experiences and their concern. He spoke to children who were grateful to be able to go to school in the camps, but also said how much they miss their homes in Myanmar. And he met other young people who still have hope to return to their homeland, but who are also worried about the impending funding cuts, which would dramatically reduce their monthly food rations from $12.50 to $6 per month. And I'll have more on those announcements from the World Food Program shortly. The Secretary General also visited a youth center where he had a chance to hear from women who are trying to build a livelihood inside the camp. The Secretary General assured every one of the people he met that he would do everything he can to stop the funding cuts, and he apologized to them because the United Nations and the international community have not been able to stop the conflict in Myanmar. He later had a press encounter in which he said he'd heard two clear messages. First, from Rohingyas who want to go back to Myanmar, and second, that they want better conditions in the camps where they're living. And at sunset, the Secretary General shared an iftar with some 60,000 refugees. He told them that sharing an iftar with them is a symbol of his deep respect for their religion and for their culture. He also said that we're facing a deep humanitarian crisis with the announced funding cuts, and he lamented that as a result, many people will suffer and some people might even die. My voice, he said, will not end until the international community understands that they have the obligation to invest now in the Rohingya refugees. Chief advisor for Bangladesh, Mohammed Yunus, was also present at the iftar, and they had met separately. They had a bilateral early in the day, and he was with the Secretary General during part of the trip. And just to give you a bit more granularity on those cuts, the World Food Program said that warned that more than 1 million people in Myanmar will be cut off from its food assistance starting in April. That's, of course, due to critical funding shortages. WFP says these cuts come just as increased conflict, displacement, and access restrictions are already sharply driving up food needs. Without an immediate new funding, WFP will only be able to assist 35,000 of the most vulnerable people, including children under the age of 5, pregnant and breastfeeding women, and people living with disabilities. The cuts will also impact some 100,000 internally displaced people in Rakhine who will have no access to food without WFP assistance, including Rohingya communities in camps. WFP urgently needs $60 million to maintain life-saving food assistance for the people of Myanmar this year. And just some more travel to announce after concluding his visit to Bangladesh. As we had already told you, the Secretary General will be traveling to Geneva in Switzerland, where he is convening the two Cypriot leaders and the guarantor powers of Greece, Turkey, and the United Kingdom for an informal meeting on Cyprus. And those meetings will be held at the UN offices in Geneva. The meeting will take place from the 17th to 18th of March and is being held in the context of the Secretary General's own good office's efforts on the Cyprus issue, and is agreed to by the two leaders on October 15th of last year. The informal meeting will provide an opportunity for meaningful discussion on the way forward on the Cyprus issue. The UN, of course, remains committed to supporting the Cypriot leaders and all Cypriots. From there, the Secretary General will travel to Brussels, and that'll take place on 18th of March. He will go there to meet with European Union leaders. As you will recall, this is something he does almost every March in the past few years. On Wednesday, he's scheduled to meet with Ursula von der Leyen, the President of the European Commission, and Antonio Costas, the President of the European Council. And he will also meet with Roberta Metsola, the President of the European Parliament. The following day, on Thursday, at the invitation of the President of the European Council, Mr. Costa, the Secretary General will take part in a working lunch with the heads of state and government of the European Union at the opening of their regular European Council meeting. While in Brussels, the Secretary General is also scheduled to have a bilateral meeting with the Prime Minister of Belgium, Bart van de Wever. And on Friday morning, the universities KU Leuven and UC Louvain will jointly award an honorary doctorate to the United Nations. The Secretary General will receive the doctorate on behalf of the organization, and in his remarks, he's expected to pay tribute to the work, to the sacrifices and dedication, and to the commitment of the thousands of men and women working for the UN around the world to serve and support the people in some of the most difficult and dangerous places on earth. The ceremony will be open, and you will be able to watch it on the web TV, the UN web TV. Turning to the situation and the dire situation in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, our humanitarian colleagues report that clashes and insecurity in the east continue to harm civilians. In South Kivu, our humanitarian partners are warning that continued violence in the territories of Uvira and Fizi has forced nearly 370,000 people to flee their homes since early February. Serious violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law have been reported, including nearly 400 cases of sexual violence reported in Uvira between the 9th and the 25th of February. That's what local partners who are monitoring the situation are telling us. Humanitarian organizations have also been targeted in Uvira. For its part, UNICEF said today that ongoing violence in South Kivu province has led to a sharp rise in grave violations against children. Verified cases of violations include sexual violence, killings, maiming, and the recruitment and use of children by armed groups. Education has also been impacted with the closure of more than 1,000 schools in the province, disrupting education of over 300,000 students. In Bukavu alone, UNICEF says that 19 schools have turned into makeshift shelters for displaced families. The impact of the continued insecurity and displacements of people have also contributed to a growing cholera outbreak, with health officials reporting more than 240 cases and 10 deaths as of March 10th in Uvira. Our partners are working in health, estimating new cholera cases doubling every week in that area. We, along with our partners, are providing cholera treatment as well as water, sanitation, and hygiene services to the area, but most resources and improved humanitarian access are needed to contain the outbreak. Still in South Kivu, since March 3rd, clashes in Walungu territory have reportedly forced more than 20,000 people to flee as they urgently need food, water, shelter, and other essential items. Yesterday, the Central Emergency Response Fund allocated $750,000 United States dollars to help prevent the cholera outbreak in North Kivu from spreading even further. The funding is part of the so-called Anticipatory Action Framework, which seeks to mitigate the impact of a deadly disease in the country. The resources will support UNICEF, they'll support World Health Organizations, and our partners providing water, sanitation, hygiene, and healthcare services. Staying nearby and turning to the Central African Republic, our peacekeeping colleagues are telling us that the second and third phase of voter registration have just begun in the country, covering 9 out of 20 prefectures and overseas centers. Our peacekeeping mission has actively contributed to the launch of the operation by providing logistical support, including the deployment of equipment by plane from Bangui to the regions, as well as several hundred electoral agents. Peacekeepers are also helping secure the process by deploying to the tense areas to enable all of Central African, Peacekeepers are also helping secure the process by deploying to tense areas to enable all Central Africans to have access to registration centers. Blue Helmets have also escorted road convoys carrying registration kits as well as electoral staff. Also to note, working in collaboration with UN Women, the mission is working to increase the number of women on the voter list by facilitating the issuance of identity documents. The voter registration exercise precedes local, legislative, and presidential elections scheduled for later this year and in 2026. The local elections, to be held for the first time in nearly 40 years, are key components to the Central African Peace Agreement and offer a unique opportunity to enhance government at the local level. Turning to the situation in Gaza, the Office of the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs tell us that the ongoing halt on aid into Gaza, which is now in its 12th consecutive day, is hindering humanitarian operations. This means that, for example, our colleagues at the World Food Program have not been able to transport any food supplies into Gaza due to the closure of all border crossing points, both humanitarian and commercial supplies. The agency says it has enough stock to support active bakeries and community kitchens for up to 1 month. WFP can also continue to provide ready-to-eat food parcels for more than 500,000 people for 2 weeks. The agency has about 63,000 metric tons of food destined for Gaza stored or in transit in the region. This is the equivalent of 2 to 3 months of distributions for 1.1 million people. That's about a bit more than half of the population in Gaza. And that's all pending authorization to enter the Strip and obviously for the need to the crossings to reopen. As it did prior to the ceasefire, WFP is reducing a quantity of ready-to-eat food parcels provided to families to stretch the supplies it has within Gaza and to serve more people in need. Meanwhile, our other partners working on health tell us that the shortage of fuel is affecting the movements of vehicles across Gaza and slowing down first responders. OCHA notes that oxygen supplies and electricity generators are also critically needed to maintain life-saving operations at hospitals in Gaza. At least 24 additional generators are needed for health centers, as the ones currently in use need maintenance and spare parts. Meanwhile, OCHA also warns that settler violence is escalating in certain areas across the West Bank, causing casualties, property damage, and placing communities at high risk of displacement. Over the past 2 years, OCHA has documented the displacement of more than 2,000 Palestinians across the West Bank due to heightened settler violence and access restrictions. Since Monday, operations in Jenin have intensified, with more than 500 people displaced in 3 neighborhoods in the eastern part of the country, according to the municipality. We and our partners warn that food insecurity is rising as operations by Israeli forces, displacement, and movement restrictions limit access to food. WFP says it's supporting more than 190,000 people with monthly cash vouchers and has provided one-off assistance to thousands of people in need. Meanwhile, OCHA has also noted a sharp increase in the demolition of Palestinian-owned structures in the West Bank over the past week and a half. The number of structures demolished during the first 10 days of Ramadan this year also exceeds the total for all of Ramadan in 2024. And in Syria, we and our partners are continuing to support the response to coastal areas. Our partners are working in health and supporting facilities in the governorates of Tartus and Latakia, providing them with medical supplies. For his part, the humanitarian resident coordinator for Syria, Adam Abdelmullah, led a mission yesterday to Harasta, near Damascus. More than 700 families recently returned to their homes from northwest Syria, with many of them now living in destroyed buildings. 80% of the town was devastated by the conflict, and some neighborhoods need to be fully rebuilt. As you may know, a conference to support Syria will take place on Monday in Brussels. Representatives from the UN will be Tom Fletcher, the Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs. He's scheduled to speak. Meanwhile, is scheduled to attend. And just to flag a couple of reports, one on global trade from our friends at UNCTAD, now known as UN Trade and Development. They warned that global trade started, it's Friday. Let's start again. UN Trade and Development today warned that global trade started 2025 on stable ground, but challenges are mounting. In a global trade update covering data through early March, points out that the world trade saw record expansion to $33 trillion in 2024, up 3.7% from the previous year. This was driven by developing economies and the strong services trade. But looking ahead, UN Trade and Development tell us that new risk looms, including trade imbalances, evolving policies, and geopolitical tensions. The trade updates notes that the gap between developing and advanced economies is widening. Asia and Latin America remain key drivers, but growth has slowed in many advanced economies. They also note that the governments are expanding tariff subsidies and industrial policies that are reshaping trade flows. According to the update, the policy realignment is contributing to uncertainty. Rising protectionism, particularly in advanced economies, is triggering retaliatory measures and just adding trade barriers. UN Trade and Development stressed that trade uncertainty grows, global cooperation and balanced policies remain critical. The challenge in 2025, UNCTAD tells us, is to prevent global fragmentation where nations form isolated trade blocs while managing policy shifts without undermining long-term growth. The action taken now by governments and businesses will shape further resilience for years to come. More online. Pay attention to this. Margaret? The Food and Agriculture Organization said today that world coffee prices reached a multi-year high in 2024, increasing 38.8% from the previous year's average. This was mostly driven by inclement weather impacting key producing countries. FAO said that coffee export prices may rise further this year if major growing regions impact further significant supply reduction. Higher shipping costs were also found to be one of the factors contributing to the increase in world coffee prices. Tomorrow, we will mark the International Day to Combat Islamophobia. This morning, the General Assembly, the Chef de Cabinet, Mr. Courtney Rattray, delivered a message on behalf of the Secretary General. In his message, the Secretary General says that from racial profiling to discriminatory policies to outright violence against individuals and their places of worship, we're witnessing a disturbing rise in anti-Muslim bigotry. He called on all to speak against xenophobia and discrimination. The Chef de Cabinet also delivered his own remarks, stressing that Islamophobia is not just about fear. It manifests in discrimination, exclusion, and violence, acts of hatred directed at individuals simply because of their faith. This is a flagrant violation of fundamental human rights, and we cannot look away, he said. Next Tuesday at 1:15, the UN Office of Partnerships and UN Women are co-hosting an event titled Women Rise for All, Turning Hope into Action. The meeting is convened by our Deputy Secretary General, Amina Mohammed. The event will feature Hala Tómasdóttir, the President of Iceland, and as our special guest, taking place in ECOSOC Chamber during the 69th session of the Commission on the Status of Women. The event will highlight the pivotal role women's leadership in advancing the Sustainable Development Goals. There is no money today, but I have a little quiz for you. What is today? Friday. No, besides that, it's Pi Day. 314. It's Pi Day. Exactly. What? That is a thing. Pi Day. Pi Day is very important for those of us who are mathematicians. 3.14. Exactly. Yes. It's not about food. It's about numbers. I know. Deji, and then Gabriel, and then Ahmed.
Yeah. My yesterday's question. Do you manage to get some response? The questionnaire.
Yes, I mean I can tell you that obviously, as you know, a number of U.S. entities, UN entities, have received questionnaires from the U.S. government. Our understanding is that they're being sent in relation to existing or potential voluntary funding from the U.S. government. Each UN system entity will decide how to respond in accordance with their respective rules.
But this kind of questionnaire asks whether you still receive fundings from, let's say, China, Cuba. Is this the right approach from one member state to the UN?
I can tell you it's like each member state will have its own approach. I can tell you it's a bit challenging.
But UN is for the humanity, not only
That's
for
correct.
US,
and,
right?
And I think the UN, as you know, is funded by all its member states, all 193 of them. Gabriel.
Thanks, Steph. For a slow Friday, there was a lot in there today.
Sorry.
Just to be clear, a follow-up to Deji's question, the guidance from the Secretary General is for all agencies to respond to this questionnaire?
Within our legal framework, whether their own legal framework, it's, you know, the UN, contrary to what people may think, is a pretty transparent place in terms of where our funding comes from, where we work, how we work. There's tons of information out there. We have nothing to hide.
So it sounds like he's leaving it up to each individual agency to choose how and if they respond. Is that a fair assessment?
They will respond within their existing rules.
Okay, and on the SG's travels to Geneva and Brussels, particularly Brussels, do you know if he has any media availability scheduled yet, or any press conferences?
You can not a press conference, but you can probably tell your colleagues they can expect him to say a few words on the very long circular carpet when you come into the European Union building.
I will pass that along. A couple more, but I'll just do one, and then maybe if we have a second round, is on WFP, your comments on Myanmar and the WFP cuts to funding. Are those cuts specifically from U.S. government funding or not sure?
It's all commingled. Obviously, as you know, the U.S. government is a huge funder of the World Food Program. Ahmed.
Thank you, Steph. Still again on Myanmar and the cuts in funding. Is there any chance that there is a negotiation with the U.S. government to reinstate the funding for these urgent?
Obviously, you know, all of our agency colleagues, our humanitarian colleagues, and others are actively engaging with their counterparts to explain to them the damage, the immediate damage that's being done.
Is there any intention or plans to issue an urgent appeal to fill the gap in funding?
Well, I mean, I think the Secretary General's own words to all of you were pretty clear on that front. Yes, Mercedes.
Hi. Regarding Syria and the statement of Secretary General yesterday, it seems like Syria is in a crossroad that it can spiral down into another civil war or sectarian violence for what we have been seeing. Beside the effort to support Syria financially and what we're going to see in Brussels, what channels has the Secretary General open with the new government to mediate?
He met with the transitional leader during the sidelines of the Cairo Arab League extraordinary meeting. Mr. Geir Pedersen and his team have had constant contact. Mr. Pedersen's deputy, Najat Roshdi, I believe, remains in Damascus. Our message, the one of inclusivity, the one of rebuilding state institutions in which all Syrians can recognize themselves, is being constantly transmitted. But it's also critical that member states that have a more direct influence on the authorities in Damascus all speak from the same song sheet to push Syria in the sense in the direction of rebuilding a state where there is where I said all Syrians, minority and ethnic minorities, feel protected, feel represented, and where there is accountability for the suffering of the Syrian people.
Because the determination of making it a Muslim government, it's already a sectarian way to start. I wonder if there is any expectation that the Brussels meeting can bring some kind, I know it's not a political meeting, but some kind of...
It is, but I think exactly right. It is not a political meeting. It is also, we will continue to push our messages, but the process in the end needs to be Syrian-owned and Syrian-led, because otherwise it can't survive. So there is a rebuilding of Syria that is institutional, and there's a rebuilding of Syria that is physical. I mean, I talked about, I think our colleague Adam Abdelmullah going to a neighborhood where 80% of the homes had already been destroyed. So there's a lot of rebuilding, literal and figurative, that needs to be done. Deji.
Sorry. Any progress of SG's potential call with President Trump?
As I said, you will be the second to know, or third to know if and when that happens. No, I mean, it's not. A phone call is not. I mean, it's not a road. Either contact happens or it doesn't happen. When it happens, I will let you know. Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Mark Carney was just sworn in as the PM of Canada. Do you have any statement on behalf of the SG?
We congratulate Mr. Carney on assuming the office of Prime Minister of Canada. The Secretary General, as you know, knows Mr. Carney well. We look forward to working with him and the new government of Canada. Are you just waving your phone about, or you're? Oh, sorry. Ahmed and then Gabriel. Sorry.
Speaking of phone calls, now with things starting to move in a little bit in the Ukraine crisis, and the G7 met already in Canada, and the Special Envoy, Mr. Witkoff, met with President Putin. Secretary General, where is he in all of these
Listen,
actions
between
the Ukrainians and the Russians?
Well, I speak for the Secretary General. I think he spoke very clearly and answered that question on Wednesday on the ceasefire. So that continues to be our position. Gabriel.
Thanks, Steph. Just to follow up on Gaza, you said that the WFP has food supplies in Gaza for another month, if I heard you correctly. Was that correct?
Yeah, I mean, it basically has but it is doing whatever it can to stretch that. Mm-hmm. But by stretching it, you make it last longer, but fewer people get aid.
And was that month from now, or from when Israel started blocking the entrances?
The way I read it and understood it is a month from now.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Oh, just to let you know, we do expect a statement welcoming the discussions between Azerbaijan and Armenia. I'd hope to have it for you. I don't, but it will be issued as soon as we get it. Happiest of Fridays to all of you, and a great weekend. And we all need coffee. Yeah, exactly. Buy coffee futures. Yeah.